There is a road in the eastern part of our country that nobody drives anymore, and I am the reason for that, though no one knows it but me. The road still exists. It still appears on certain old maps if you look carefully enough, a thin gray line wandering away from the main highway like a thread someone forgot to cut. But the signs that used to point to it were taken down years ago, and the turnoff itself has been swallowed by weeds taller than a child. I drove past that turnoff last spring on my way to a funeral, and I almost stopped the car. I almost got out. I almost walked into those weeds to see if the road was still under them. I did not. I am telling you this now because I am 61 years old, and my doctor has given me a number of months that is smaller than the number of years I lived before any of this happened. And I would like for one person, even a stranger, to know what I did when I was 24. I would like for the weight of it to be carried by someone other than me for a little while, even if only in the form of disbelief. My name does not matter. What matters is that in the autumn of 1986, I was a junior land surveyor for a regional engineering firm based out of a small city I will not name. We did boundary work, mostly, property disputes, easements for the power company, the occasional state contract when a county wanted its township lines redrawn after a flood or a fire. I had been with the firm for 2 years, and I was still the youngest man on staff, which meant I got the assignments no one else wanted. Long drives, cold mornings, landowners who answered the door with a shotgun resting against the inside of the frame. I did not mind any of it. I had grown up on a farm myself, and I understood that suspicion in country people is not the same thing as hostility. It is closer to grief. They have all watched something be taken from them, even if they cannot name what it was. That October, my supervisor handed me a folder and told me I would be gone for a week. The folder contained a single map, a list of 3 names, and a state contract number. The map showed a village I had never heard of, tucked into a fold of low hills about 200 miles east of our office. The contract was unusual. The state wanted the village formally dissolved. That was the word on the paperwork. Dissolved. The population had dropped below the minimum required to maintain its status as an incorporated place, and the state wanted someone to walk the property lines, confirm the boundaries of each parcel, and certify that the existing residents, if any, had been notified of the dissolution and given the proper forms to sign. I asked how many residents there were. My supervisor looked at the folder again, then at me, then out the window. He said the last census put it at 4. That was 8 years earlier. He said the state was assuming the number was now 0 or near it, and that my job was mostly to make it official. He told me to bring extra water because the well at the old municipal building had been condemned, and to bring a camera because the state wanted photographs of every standing structure for the dissolution record. He said the drive-in was rough, but the village itself was small enough to walk in an afternoon. He said I would be home by Friday. He shook my hand the way men shake hands when they are not sure what they are wishing each other. I left on a Monday morning before sunrise. The drive was long and uneventful for the first 4 hours. I stopped once for gas at a station outside a town whose name I have forgotten, and I remember the attendant, an older man with a hearing aid, asked me where I was headed. I told him. He did not respond. He took my money, gave me my change, and went back inside without saying goodbye. I told myself he had not heard me clearly. I have told myself a lot of things over the years. The road into the village was exactly as my supervisor had described it. Gravel for the first 3 miles, then dirt, then something that was not really a road at all, just 2 ruts pressed into the earth by decades of wheels. The trees on either side were old, the kind of old you do not see anymore in places where logging has been thorough. Their branches met above the road in a long arched corridor, and the light that came through them was the soft brown light of a church basement. I drove slowly, partly because of the ruts, and partly because the silence outside the truck had a quality I could not quite name. It was not the absence of sound. It was the presence of something that was not sound. I rolled my window down once to listen, and I could hear my own breathing and the ticking of the engine, and nothing else. No birds, no wind in the leaves, even though the leaves were moving. I rolled the window back up. The village appeared the way villages appear in dreams. One moment there was forest, and the next moment there was a clearing, and in the clearing there were houses. I counted 11 from the road. There may have been more set back behind the others, but I did not see them at first. The houses were arranged in a rough loop around a central green, the kind of layout you see in old settlements where everyone wanted to be within shouting distance of the well. There was a small church at the far end of the green, white painted, its steeple leaning a few degrees to the east. There was a building that had been a general store, judging by the faded letters above the door. There was a building that had been a schoolhouse. There were no cars. There were no power lines. I parked the truck at the edge of the green and sat in it for a long time before I got out. I do not know why. The village looked abandoned in a way that abandoned villages are supposed to look. The paint was peeling. The grass was tall. A window on the second floor of the nearest house was broken, and a curtain was hanging halfway out of it, moving slightly in a wind I could not feel inside the truck. There was nothing wrong with the picture, and yet I sat in the truck for what must have been 20 minutes before I opened the door and stepped out. The first thing I noticed when I stepped out was the smell. It was not the smell of decay, which I had expected. It was the smell of a house that has been lived in, cooking grease, wood smoke, the faint sourness of laundry that has been hung indoors too long. I stood beside the truck and turned in a slow circle and tried to find the source of the smell, and I could not. There were no chimneys with smoke coming out of them. There were no lights in any of the windows. The smell was simply there, distributed evenly across the whole village, the way a fog is distributed. I took my clipboard and my camera and I walked to the nearest house. The state forms required me to knock at every door, announce myself, and record the response. If there was no response, I was to note the date and time, photograph the front of the structure, and move on. I knocked at the first house and announced myself. My voice sounded smaller than it should have, the way voices sound in rooms with heavy curtains. I waited the required 30 seconds. There was no response. I wrote down the date and the time, and I lifted my camera to photograph the front of the house, and through the viewfinder, in the window to the left of the front door, I saw a woman looking back at me. I lowered the camera. The window was empty. I lifted the camera again. The woman was there. I lowered it again, and she was gone. I stood on the front step of that house for what I would later estimate to be 3 or 4 minutes, raising and lowering the camera, and each time I looked through the viewfinder, she was there, and each time I looked with my own eyes, she was not. She was a woman of perhaps 40 years, with dark hair pulled back from her face, wearing a pale blue dress with a collar. She was not smiling. She was not frowning. She was looking at me the way a person looks at someone they have been expecting for a long time and are mildly disappointed to finally see. I should have left then. I want to be clear about that. I have had 37 years to think about the moment I should have gotten back in the truck. And that was the moment. But I was 24 years old, and I had a state contract in my folder, and I had been raised to finish what I started. And I told myself that I was tired from the drive, that the light was strange, that the camera had some kind of reflection issue I did not understand. I lowered the camera one more time, looked at the empty window with my own eyes, and walked to the next house. I knocked. I announced myself. I waited. There was no response. I lifted the camera, and through the viewfinder, in the window to the right of the front door, the same woman was looking back at me. The same dress, the same hair, the same expression of mild disappointment. I want to describe this carefully because for a long time afterward, I tried to convince myself I had been mistaken, that the woman in the second house had only resembled the woman in the first, that my memory had collapsed two similar faces into a single one. But she was not similar. She was the same small mark above her left eyebrow, the same way her collar sat slightly askew on the right side, the same hands folded in front of her at the level of her waist, the left thumb tucked under the right palm. I walked to the third house. I knocked. I lifted the camera. She was there. Pale blue dress, dark hair, folded hands, watching me through the viewfinder from a window that was empty to the naked eye. I walked to the fourth house, the fifth, the sixth. She was in every window of every house. Sometimes she was on the ground floor, sometimes the second. Sometimes she was to the left of the door, sometimes to the right. Once she was in an attic window I had not even noticed until I lifted the camera and saw her there, framed by a triangle of glass at the very top of the house, looking down at me. She was always in the same dress. She was always making the same expression. She was always folded the same way. I stopped counting at the seventh house. I sat down on the front step of it with the camera in my lap, and I put my head in my hands, and I tried to think clearly. I told myself the camera was broken. I took the lens cap off and put it back on. I checked the film. I rewound it slightly and advanced it again. I pointed the camera at the truck, at the church, at my own boot, and through the viewfinder, everything looked normal. I pointed it back at the window of the seventh house, and she was there. I think this is the part of the story that is hardest for people to believe, so I will say it as plainly as I can. I was not afraid yet. I was confused. I was unsettled. But the fear had not arrived. Fear, in my experience, requires you to understand what is being threatened. I did not yet understand that anything was being threatened. I thought I was looking at a trick of light, or a flaw in the camera, or some hallucination caused by the long drive and the strange quiet. I thought I would figure it out, and then I would have a story to tell at the office on Monday. I was 24 years old. I had not yet learned that the worst things in the world do not announce themselves with fear. They announce themselves with curiosity. I stood up from the step of the seventh house and I tried the door. It was not locked. The doors in old villages rarely are. I pushed it open and I called out, and my voice went into the house and came back to me thinner than it had gone in. The front room was a small parlor. There was a wood stove on the far wall, a rag rug on the floor, a rocking chair near the window. The chair was rocking, slightly. The motion was so small I almost missed it. There was no one in it. I stepped inside. I walked to the window where I had seen her through the viewfinder. The window was empty. I lifted the camera and looked through it at the window, from the inside, and she was not there either. I lowered the camera and turned around, and she was standing in the doorway behind me. I do not remember screaming. I am told, by people who knew me later, that I have a quiet voice even when I am frightened, and I think this must be true, because I do not remember making any sound at all. She was perhaps 10 feet away from me in the doorway of the parlor, and she was looking at me with the same mild disappointment, and her hands were folded the same way, and the pale blue of her dress was the exact color of a sky that has just begun to lose the sun. She said my name. She said it the way someone says the name of a child they have not seen in many years, with recognition and a small sadness and no surprise. She said it once, and she waited, and when I did not respond, she said it again, and this time she added a question. She asked me if I had come to take her home. Her voice was ordinary. That is the part I want you to understand. Her voice was the voice of any woman of her age, soft, a little tired, with the faint accent of a region I could not place. There was nothing about her voice that was wrong. The wrongness was in the fact that she was there at all, and that she knew me, and that she was waiting for an answer. I did not give her one. I do not think I could have. I walked past her, sideways, the way you walk past a dog you are not sure of, and I went out the front door of the house, and I walked across the green to my truck, and I got inside it, and I locked the doors. I sat there with my hands on the steering wheel, and I watched the houses. None of the doors opened. No one followed me. The curtain in the broken second-floor window kept moving in a wind I could not feel. After a while, I noticed that my camera was still in my lap, and that the lens cap was off, and that the strap was wrapped around my wrist in a way I did not remember wrapping it. I should have driven away. I keep saying that. I should have driven away. Instead, I opened the folder on the passenger seat and I looked at the list of 3 names. The contract had given me 3 names of residents who had been on the last census 8 years earlier. I had not looked at the names carefully before. I had assumed they would mean nothing to me. I looked at them now. The first name was a man's name. I did not recognize it. The second name was a man's name. I did not recognize it. The third name was a woman's name, and it was my mother's name. I want to be careful here. My mother's name was not an unusual name. It was the kind of name that, in that part of the country, in that generation, you might find on one in every 50 mailboxes. The first name was common. The last name was less common, but not rare. I told myself, sitting in the truck, that the coincidence was strange, but not impossible. My mother had grown up 200 miles from this village. She had never mentioned it. She had never, in any conversation I could remember, even hinted that she had been to the eastern part of the state. She had been born on a farm and had married my father at 19 and had lived in the same county her whole life until she died of a stroke when I was 16, 8 years before that October afternoon. 8 years. The last census had been 8 years earlier. I sat in the truck for a long time with the folder open on my lap. The light in the village was beginning to change. The sun was not setting yet, but the shadows had started to lengthen, the way shadows do in the late afternoon in autumn, and the houses were beginning to look less like houses and more like the spaces between houses. I do not know how to explain that. They looked like absences shaped like houses. I had the sense, sitting there, that if I looked away from any one of them for too long, it would not be there when I looked back. I made a decision. I want to say I made it bravely. I did not. I made it the way you make decisions when you are 24, and you have been raised to believe that the world makes sense if you ask it the right questions. I decided that I would go back to the 7th house, where I had seen her, and I would ask her who she was. I decided that there had to be an explanation, and that the explanation would involve a confused old woman, Perhaps a relative of my mother's I had never been told about. Perhaps a squatter. Perhaps someone the state had forgotten to remove from the rolls. I decided that I would be polite and careful, and that I would write down what she said, and I would leave before dark. I got out of the truck. I walked back across the green. The door of the 7th house was still open the way I had left it. I went inside. The rocking chair was still moving. She was sitting in it. She was sitting in it as if she had always been sitting in it, as if the few minutes during which I had walked across the green and back had not happened, or had happened to someone else. She looked up at me when I came in, and she smiled, and it was the first time I had seen her smile. And the smile did not change her face the way smiles usually change faces. The mild disappointment was still there underneath it. The smile sat on top of the disappointment like a tablecloth on a stained table. She said my name again. She said, "Sit down." She gestured to a chair across from her, a straight-backed wooden chair that I had not noticed before, and I sat in it because I did not know what else to do. She asked me about my drive. She asked me if the road had been hard. She asked me if I had eaten. She spoke to me with the easy familiarity of an aunt, the kind of aunt who has not seen you since you were small and who is determined to pretend that no time has passed. I answered her questions because the alternative, which was to ask her my own, felt impossible. My mouth would not form the questions. My throat closed around them. After a while, she stopped asking, and she simply looked at me. The look was long and patient and very sad. And then she said something I have never been able to forget, and which I have never told anyone, not my wife, not my children, not the priest I spoke to twice in my 40s, when I thought I might be losing my mind. She said, "Your mother was the last one." She said it the way you would tell a child that the rain had stopped, simply, without weight. She said, "Your mother was the last one, and after her, there was no one else, and so we have been waiting for the next one to come." I asked her what she meant. My voice came out as a whisper. She did not answer me directly. She told me instead a story. She told me that the village had been founded a long time ago by a group of families who had come east looking for land, and that the land they had found was good land, but that the land had a condition. She used that word, condition. She said the families had not understood the condition at first, but they had come to understand it, and they had agreed to it, because by the time they understood it, they had already built their houses and planted their fields and buried their dead, and to leave would have meant leaving behind too much of themselves. The condition, she said, was that the village required a woman, not a particular woman, any woman, as long as she was the right kind. The right kind was a woman who had been chosen by the village itself, who had walked into it without being invited, and who had agreed, even silently, even without knowing she was agreeing, to stay. The village, she said, did not take women by force. It only took women who came to it. But it had ways of calling them. It had ways of putting itself in their dreams, or in the dreams of their mothers, or in the dreams of their mothers' mothers. It had ways of making itself known. She told me that there had always been one woman in the village, just one. The men of the families had lived and died around her, and their wives and daughters had lived and died around her. But the woman was always there, in every house, at every window, in every kitchen, and every parlor, and every bedroom. She was the village. The village was her. When one woman grew tired, the village would call another, and the new woman would come, and the old woman would be allowed to rest. To go home, she said. That was the phrase she used. To go home, she said my mother had been the last one. She said my mother had come to the village when she was 19 years old, the year before she married my father, and she had stayed for one summer, and the village had loved her, and she had loved the village. But she had not been able to agree to stay forever. She had been engaged already. She had a life waiting for her. She had left, the woman said, with the village's blessing, but with the understanding that she owed it something. A daughter, perhaps, or a son who would one day come back, I asked her, and my voice was steadier now than it had been, what it was that she wanted from me. She said she wanted me to take her place. She said the village had been waiting for 8 years. She said she was very tired. She said that the woman in the village did not have to be a woman in the way I understood the word. The village did not care about that. The village cared about the agreement, about the presence, about someone being there, in every window, in every house, watching the road for the next traveler. She said it was not a bad life. She said it was quiet. She said the village would care for me the way it had cared for her and for the woman before her, and for all the women going back to the first one, whose name no one remembered anymore. She said I would not have to die. I would only have to stay. I asked her what would happen if I refused. She looked at me for a long time before she answered. The light in the window behind her had changed again. It was the color of an old bruise now, that particular yellow-purple that the sky turns just before true dusk. She said that if I refused, I could leave. The village would not hold me. The village had never held anyone who did not agree. But, she said, the village had called my mother, and my mother had owed it a child, and if the child refused, the debt would not disappear. The debt would simply move. It would find someone else in my family, a sister perhaps, a daughter, a niece, someone I loved, someone who would come to the village one day, the way my mother had come, the way I had come, and who would be asked the same question, and who would have to answer. I did not have a sister. I did not have a daughter. I was not yet married. But I had a younger cousin, a girl of 17, who had been close to my mother before my mother died, and who had inherited, my aunt said, my mother's eyes and my mother's hands and my mother's habit of staring out of windows at things no one else could see. I thought of her then, sitting in that parlor, with the woman in the pale blue dress watching me. I thought of her very clearly. I asked the woman if she was telling me the truth. She said the village did not lie. She said the village had no reason to lie. She said lying was a thing people did when they were afraid, and the village was not afraid of anything, because it had already outlasted everything it could have been afraid of. I asked her how long I had to decide. She said I had until sunrise. She stood up from the rocking chair then, and she walked past me, and she went out the front door of the house and into the green. I followed her to the doorway, and I watched her go. She walked across the grass in the failing light, and she went into the next house, and a few seconds later, I saw her in the window of that house, watching the road. She was in the window of the house after that one too, and the one after that. By the time I had counted all the windows I could see, she was in every one of them, the same woman, the same dress, the same folded hands, watching me from every direction at once. I went back to my truck. I sat in it through the night. I did not sleep. I do not remember being tired. I remember the cold, and the way the windshield fogged from my breath, and the way the moon, when it rose, looked smaller than it should have, as if it were farther away from this place than from the rest of the world. I remember thinking about my mother. I remember trying to remember if she had ever said anything anything at all about the eastern part of the state, about a village, about a summer when she was 19. I could not remember her saying anything, but I could remember the way she used to stand at the kitchen window in the evenings, with her hands folded in front of her at the level of her waist, the left thumb tucked under the right palm, watching the road, watching for something, watching for someone, and I had never asked her what she was watching for, because I had been a child, and children do not ask their mothers those kinds of questions until it is too late. I thought about my cousin. I thought about her 17 years, her dark hair, the way she had cried at my mother's funeral with a quiet, steady grief that had seemed too old for her. I thought about her growing up, marrying, having children, and one day, perhaps in her 20s, perhaps in her 40s, getting a phone call or a letter or a strange feeling and following it to a place she had never been, where someone would be waiting for her in every window. I thought about staying. I want to be honest about this. I thought about staying for a long time that night. I was 24 years old, and I was not yet anyone in particular. I had no wife. I had no children. I had a job I was good at, but did not love. I had a small apartment with a leaking faucet and a cat that my neighbor was feeding for the week. I had a father who had been distant since my mother's death, and who would, I knew even then, not survive me by very many years. The list of things in the world that needed me was a short list. The list of things in the world that I needed was shorter. But I was a coward. I want to say that clearly. I have spent the rest of my life trying to convince myself that what I did was brave, and I have never been able to. I was a coward, and I drove away. I started the truck just before sunrise, when the sky was beginning to turn the color of the dress, and I put it in reverse, and I backed down that road for almost a mile before I found a place wide enough to turn around. I did not look at the houses as I left. I did not look in the rearview mirror. I drove with my eyes fixed on the road in front of me, and when the gravel finally turned to asphalt and I came out onto the main highway, I pulled over onto the shoulder, and I was sick into the weeds for a long time. I drove home. I went to my office on Monday morning, and I gave my supervisor the folder. I had filled out every form. I had photographed every house. I had marked every parcel as unoccupied. I had certified that no residents remained in the village and that the dissolution could proceed. My supervisor looked at the photographs, and he nodded, and he said good work, and he filed the folder, and the state dissolved the village a few months later, and that was the end of my official involvement. The photographs, when they were developed, showed empty windows, every one of them. I want to say that for the record. The woman in the pale blue dress did not appear in any photograph, only in the viewfinder, only in the moment of looking. The film itself was clean. I tried, for a few years, to forget. I was good at it for a while. I got married at 28 to a woman I had met at a friend's wedding, a kind and patient woman who is still my wife, and we had 2 sons, and I changed careers, and I built a life that had nothing to do with surveying or boundaries or roads that did not appear on new maps. I told myself that the village had been a kind of breakdown, a stress reaction, a story my exhausted mind had built around an empty place. I told myself that the name on the contract had been a coincidence. I told myself that my mother had never been to that village, that she had never owed anything to anyone, that her habit of standing at the window in the evenings had been the habit of a tired farm wife and nothing more. I told myself a great many things. My cousin died when she was 23. She was driving home from a friend's house one evening, and her car went off the road in a part of the state where she had no reason to be, almost 200 miles east of where she lived. The police said she must have gotten lost. They said the road she had taken was an old county road that had not been maintained in years, that it should not have been drivable, that they could not explain why she had turned onto it. Her car was found at the end of it, in a clearing, parked neatly beside what had once been a village green. There were no houses left standing by then. The state had condemned and demolished them the year before as part of the dissolution process. There was only the foundation of the church and the foundations of the houses and the tall grass and her car with the keys still in the ignition and the driver's door open and her purse on the passenger seat and no sign of her anywhere. They searched for her for 2 weeks. They never found her. I went to the search on the second day. I stood at the edge of the clearing with my uncle, her father, and I looked at the empty foundations where the houses had been, and I felt nothing at all. That is the worst part of this story, and the part I have been least able to forgive myself for. I felt nothing, not surprise, not grief, not even the fear I had felt 8 years earlier in the truck. I felt the absence of feeling, which is its own kind of knowledge. I knew where she was. I knew she was not lost. I knew that somewhere, in a village that no longer existed on any map, in a house that no longer had walls, she was standing at a window in a pale blue dress with her hands folded in front of her at the level of her waist, watching the road, watching for the next traveler, watching with the same mild disappointment that the woman before her had worn, and the woman before that, all the way back to the first one whose name no one remembers. I drove home that night, and I did not tell anyone what I knew. I did not tell my uncle. I did not tell my wife. I did not tell the police, who would not have believed me, and who would have been right not to believe me because there was no evidence and no village and no woman in any photograph. Only the testimony of a man who had filed a state form 37 years ago certifying that the place was empty. My uncle died of grief within 5 years. He never stopped looking for her. He drove that part of the state on weekends for the rest of his life, knocking on doors, showing her picture, asking questions. He believed until the end that she had been taken by a person, a man in a truck, a stranger at a gas station, something he could imagine, something he could hate. I let him believe it. I think about that too. I let him believe it because the truth would not have been a comfort, and because the truth was mine, and I was too much of a coward to share it. I am 61 years old now. My wife is asleep in the next room. My sons are grown and have children of their own, 2 girls and a boy, all under the age of 10. The girls have my mother's eyes. I have noticed this. I noticed it the first time I held the older one when she was a few hours old, and I felt a cold thing move through me that I had not felt since I was 24 years old and sitting in a truck at the edge of a green at sunrise. I have noticed since then that the older one has a habit of standing at the window in her parents' house in the evenings, looking out at the street, with her small hands folded in front of her at the level of her waist. She is 7 years old. Her mother thinks it is sweet. Her mother does not know. I have been to that part of the state again. I went last spring, as I said, on my way to a funeral, and I almost stopped. I have driven past the turnoff 3 times in the last 10 years, and each time it has been harder to drive past. The signs are gone, but the road is still there under the weeds. The village is still there under the foundations. The woman is still there under the grass. I know this the way I know my own name. I have been thinking, in the months since my doctor gave me his number, about whether there is something I could still do. Whether I could go back, whether I could walk down that road one more time in the pale gray hour before sunrise and find the place where the parlor used to be and sit down in a rocking chair that is no longer there and say to a woman in a pale blue dress that I have finally come to take her home. Whether the village would accept the exchange after all this time, whether it would let my cousin go, whether it would forget about the girls. I do not know if it works that way. The woman told me that night that the village did not lie, but she did not tell me everything. She did not tell me whether the debt could be paid late. She did not tell me whether a man of 61 with months to live was worth the same as a girl of 23 or a boy of 24. She did not tell me whether, if I went, I would be allowed to be the one in the windows, or whether I would simply be one more body in the grass. I have not decided yet. I keep the camera in a box in my closet. The same camera. I never threw it away, although I never used it again either. It still has film in it, the same roll I loaded that morning 37 years ago, with 3 frames left unused. I have thought, sometimes, about taking those last 3 frames, about driving out there and lifting the camera to my eye and seeing what is in the windows now, about whether she is still there, in her pale blue dress with her hands folded, watching the road, about whether she would still recognize me, about whether she would still say my name. I think she would. I think she has been saying it, quietly, for 37 years, into the empty air above a clearing where 11 houses used to stand. I think she has been waiting, the way she said she had been waiting before, patiently, without anger, with only that mild disappointment that I now understand was not disappointment in me, but disappointment in herself for having to ask at all. I think the village is patient because it has always been patient. I think it can wait another 7 years, or another 17, or another 70. I think it is waiting for one of the girls now. I think it has already begun to call her. I think that is why she stands at the window in the evenings. I think that is why her hands are folded the way they are. I have one thing left to do. I have not done it yet. I am writing this down first because I want there to be a record somewhere in case I lose my nerve, in case I decide in the end to stay in this house with my wife and let the months run out and let the girls grow up and let whatever happens, happen. I want there to be a record so that one of my sons, someday, can read this and understand, so that if the older girl, when she is 19 or 23 or 24, has a strange dream or feels a strange pull, or finds herself driving east on a road she does not remember choosing, he will know what to tell her. He will know to tell her not to go. He will know to tell her that her grandmother went, and her grandmother's son did not, and her cousin did, and the debt is not hers, and she does not have to answer when the village calls her name. I do not know if that will be enough. I do not know if anything is enough against a thing that has been patient for as long as that village has been patient. But I want him to try. I want someone to try, finally, who is not me. I am going to put this letter in the same box as the camera. I am going to seal the box and write my older son's name on it and leave it on the top shelf of my closet, where my wife will find it after I am gone, and where she will give it to him because he is the older one, and he was always the one I trusted with difficult things. I am going to tell him, in a separate note, only that the box is to be opened if anything ever happens to one of his daughters, anything unusual, anything that cannot be explained, a wrong turn, a long silence, a drive that takes too long to come home from. And then I am going to decide. I am going to sit in this chair, in this quiet house, with my wife asleep in the next room, and I am going to decide whether I am the kind of man, finally, at 61, that I was not at 24, whether I can do, late, what I could not do early. Whether I can go back down a road that should not exist anymore and walk into a clearing where there are no houses anymore and find a woman who has been waiting for me since before I was born and tell her that I have come to take her home. If I do, you will not hear from me again. There will be a car found, eventually, at the end of a road that does not appear on any map, with the keys in the ignition and the driver's door open, and a wallet on the passenger seat, and no sign of the driver anywhere. The police will say I must have wandered off. They will search for 2 weeks and they will not find me. My wife will grieve. My sons will grieve. The girls will be told that their grandfather got lost on a drive, and they will believe it because they are children, and because children believe what they are told until they are old enough to ask the questions their parents cannot answer. But the older one will stop standing at the window in the evenings. I believe that. I have to believe that. I have to believe that the village, having waited so long, will accept a late payment, that it will let her go, that her small folded hands will unfold, and her eyes will become her own eyes again, and she will grow up and marry and have children of her own, and never, in her whole long life, feel the pull of a road she has never driven toward a place she has never been. That is what I am going to decide tonight. I am almost decided already. The camera is on the desk beside me. I have just lifted it a few minutes ago, and I have looked through the viewfinder here in my own study, in my own house, 200 miles from a village that no longer exists. I have pointed it at the window across the room, the window that looks out onto my own quiet street, where the streetlights are on and a neighbor's dog is barking somewhere down the block, and everything is exactly as it should be. I have looked through the viewfinder at that window. She is in it. She is in my window now, in her pale blue dress, with her hands folded, watching me. She is not disappointed anymore. She is smiling, the same small smile she gave me in the parlor that night, the smile that sat on top of the sadness like a tablecloth on a stained table. She is smiling because she knows what I have decided. She knew before I did. She has always known. I am going to put the camera down now. I am going to finish this letter. I am going to seal the box. I am going to kiss my wife on the forehead without waking her. And I am going to take my keys from the hook by the door. And I am going to drive east in the dark, the way my mother must have driven east in the dark when she was 19. The way my cousin must have driven east in the dark when she was 23. The way every traveler before us must have driven east in the dark since the first families built the first houses around the first green and agreed to the condition of the land. I am going to take her home. And then, if the village keeps its word, the windows in my granddaughter's house will be empty again. Just empty. The way windows are supposed to be. The way they were in every photograph I took, in every frame of film, in every picture that did not show what was really there. The last thing I want to say is this. If you are reading this, and you have ever driven down a road you do not remember choosing, and come to a clearing you do not remember looking for, and seen a house with a window in it, and felt for one moment that someone inside that window knew your name, turn around. Get back in the car, drive until the road is paved again, and then drive farther, and do not stop, and do not look in the rearview mirror, and do not answer if anyone calls you by a name you did not give them. The village is patient. The village can wait. But it cannot take you if you do not agree, and it cannot keep you if you do not stay. And the only debt it can collect is the one you let it collect. My mother let it collect hers. I am letting it collect mine. Do not let it collect yours.